Okay, well, we'll make a start. Well, thank you very much for coming. And of course, this is a free event, I understand. But just because it's free doesn't mean it's a giveaway. In fact, quite the reverse. If there's one person that I'm most excited to have present at EA Sustain in 2024, it's Ian Tolhurst, or Tolly as we can call him. He is a phenomenon and an extraordinary farmer that should really be, in my estimation, be advising government at the absolutely highest level. But and I'll just give you a brief introduction to him, and then Tolly's just going to run through a brief presentation, and then we've got a Q&A session between the two of us, and then we'll throw it open as much as possible to the audience. So Ian is a pioneer of animal-free organic farming and has been at the forefront of UK organic farming for 45 years. He is recognised as a model of sustainability, but also as a pioneer of fertility systems that break the link between livestock sourced fertilisers. Tolhurst Organics is a unique long-term experiment now widely studied by all sorts of institutions, and about working with nature and without artificial chemical or animal inputs. He's been an agricultural advisor to the Moldovan government and was awarded an MBE for his services to agriculture in 2023. So this is Iain Tolhurst.
Well, thank you, Mark. Yeah, I'm flattered, actually, to hear this from Mark. Mark came to my farm last year to interview me for a book that he still hasn't finished, I understand. We got on really well because we had a common ground in that we both adored and loved birds. And this is really where I started from in my youth. I started to get interested in birds, and that's how I ended up where I am, really. So we have a lot in common in that respect. And this is our farm. This is a part of our farm up here. I'll be putting a few brief slides up there. I'm not going to really talk through them very much. I'm just going to put them up as and when we talk.
Okay. Do you want to? Okay. So shall I kick off with the questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Well, one of the things that struck me about EA Sustain is we've heard from people like Charles on the Murky Waters talk, and then there are a couple of fantastic women talking about sourcing leather from the field right through to the fashion status, Sarah and Alice. And I'm interested very often in the journeys that people have made. And Tolly's is in some ways one of the most interesting of all. You had no advantages really, Tolly. You came from a working class background, an urban environment in Bristol. And yet you've become one of the absolute icons of organic farming. I mean, how did you begin that journey?
Right, okay, life story. So the journey began as a child. I am from a very working class background. My father was a carpenter, my mother was a housewife. We lived in a very small house in a terrace in extreme western suburbs of Bristol, but we were very close to the countryside. I was just 2 streets away from countryside. We also had redundant coal pits and quarries, which were fantastic places to hang out at. So I was spending a lot of time in places that I was not allowed to go to. We heard earlier about the freedom we had as children. I think Helen mentioned it. You know, as children, we were pretty much allowed to go anywhere. Our parents didn't know where we were most of the time, which was completely different from how I was with my children. So I had a lot of freedom. You say I didn't have many advantages, but I had the advantage of freedom, which I think was really valuable. So I was spending a lot of time in the fields, and I liked being in the countryside. We had a garden. It wasn't very big. It was quite small, but I loved the garden. My father built the garden and then did nothing, and my mother took it over. I also took the garden over as a child from about the age of 9. My grandfather came. He used to come once a year for a couple of weeks. He came from London. He was a tram driver during the war. He would stay for a couple of weeks. He was a gardener. He, as many people from that generation, had a back garden full of vegetables. He took me to a shop one day and he bought me 10, or it's probably in those days, 12 Brussels sprout plants, which we put in the garden. That was the start of my horticultural career because I nurtured those plants. I got a crop. I don't remember eating it. I probably didn't like Brussels sprouts anyway. I mean, how many children do? But also, by chance, and again, this was this was an opportunity. A neighbour 4 doors down the road, who we called Uncle. He wasn't an uncle. He was the only friend of my family, actually. Uncle Harry had some strawberries in his garden, and I was fascinated by these strawberries. They grew little plants all over the place, and I liked eating strawberries. So it became quite an interesting facility for me to have these strawberry plants in my garden. So he gave me some plants, I started to grow them, and again, that was a reinforcement of my horticulture. So that, along with the access to countryside, looking at birds, I was fascinated by birds, particularly anything remote like a raptor. Kestrels, I would cycle miles to go and see a kestrel. So that interaction with the countryside really got me started in agriculture. There is nobody in my family, we've gone back many generations, nobody in my family that's been involved in agriculture at all. They've all been working class people. So I was the first one that had an interest in this, and that was, those formative years during, my early teens were really important to me. I kind of went off the idea as I got a slightly older teens because girls turned up and that kind of distracted me, But from the age of 21, I got back into agriculture more by default than by design. I needed somewhere to live, and I ended up on a large dairy farm in Buckinghamshire with 160 cows working on what even then was a very intensive system. And I saw in that farm, how intensive it was, how the cows were being really, maxed out to the point where they were only surviving maybe 4 or 5 lactations, which is more than they do today. And the land was being badly treated. There was a complete absence of life in the soil, and the bird population I could see was decreasing. And it was the bird population that really got me more concerned about anything. I read Silent Spring at that point. I don't know if anybody knows Silent Spring. It was a pivotal work done by Rachel Carson about the Green Revolution in the US and how it impacted on the wildlife, particularly the bird population in the US. That really changed a lot of my thinking at that point.
Tolly, it's interesting you say about freedom. That is one of the things that is, you see it as a massive advantage. It's such an important point that we have so restricted from a distance of about 5 miles when, in the 1970s, when I was growing up, parents allowing their children to be away, and now it's down to about 100 meters. Freedom, and also the garden. I've just driven through into Colchester. I was looking at all these new builds. None of them has actually got a garden. You couldn't grow strawberries in those patches. How are we going to have a relationship with nature if we don't have a little bit of the land itself? But those weren't my questions, but those were points you raised, which I think are important. But just, you said to me, and one of the great advantages of going to Tolhurst to interview him is you get to taste his extraordinary strawberries, which are the best strawberries you'll ever eat. But you said to me the most important equipment that a farmer has. What you said? What's the most important thing that a farmer has? And I can't remember what bit of technology I suggested, but you suggested something slightly more fundamental.
Yeah, this is the question I often ask when I get groups of farmers together. I do seminars and workshops sometimes, and the question is, what is the most useful tool you have on your farm? You get all sorts of things like the wheelbarrow or the hoe or the tractor. All the blokes like anything with wheels. The women come up with often a different solution. But the real answer is actually, it's the power of observation. It's the eyes. The most critical element of your farm is using your eyes and the power of observation. And joining your eyes to your brain, which is not that difficult, and questioning what you see is a really powerful way of looking at your farm and learning from what you see. So it's the power of observation, which I find is so important.
Yeah, one of the striking aspects of a farmed environment and of farming is maintaining the highest diversity of species on your grown land, almost until it replicates a sort of natural system. Can you just tell us a little bit about how you use this process of observation and experimentation to develop a system of, what are they called, undersown lays, etc. So that sometimes you have sort of 20, 30 plants undersown in any crop. Just take us a little bit through, because nobody else is doing that, are they? Nobody else is...
Not many people. It's starting to become more popular now, partly as a result of what I do, but also as a result of what other people are seeing as well.
Yeah. So that how many plants do you undersow in a crop?
Well, we physically undersow up to 25 or 30, but then we also have what we call the weed seed bank, which is the natural seed bank of the soil, which can be millions of seeds per cubic meter of soil. We have that, and we cherish that. When I first started in growing, it was all about killing everything. It was about killing weeds, killing pests, killing diseases. It's a negative approach to everything, and that's how horticulture and agriculture has been developing over the last 200 years, all about killing everything. Well, it hasn't worked. You know, we've been killing everything for the last 200 years, and we haven't got anywhere forward at all in terms of controlling pests, diseases, and weeds. They are still very prevalent in agriculture. So I was looking at this thing, well, this is not the right approach. Maybe we need to start leaving things to live a bit more. So my whole policy in terms of increasing biodiversity became the single most important factor on the farm. And if you'd asked me 25 or 30 years ago what we grow on our farm, I would have told you we grow vegetables. If you ask me today, I would tell you we grow biodiversity. And the vegetables are byproducts of that, rather than the other way around. I mean, a lot of farms look at biodiversity as a bolt-on extra. We don't see it that way. We look at biodiversity as being integral to the whole farm. We accept the farm and honour the farm as a complete biological system, and we try to avoid looking at all the components of that system as independents. We try to avoid reductionist thinking. We don't look at just carbon. We don't look at just carbon because we need to understand biodiversity. We need to understand the whole system's approach. So the system really governs everything. Mm-hmm. And it was that need to have that complete system which brought me to the point where I thought, well, we need to get much more biological diversity. And the easiest biological diversity is plants. Everything else comes once you get the plants. The insects, the mammals, you know, all the food chain above that will develop once you get the plants in base. So our agriculture is completely and totally solely dependent on a plant-based system. That's what we grow. We grow plants. Some of those plants we can eat, but it's not the prime mover. The prime mover on the farm is not production of food, it's production of biological diversity, and the food is a byproduct of that. And we can produce pretty good yields doing this.
Yeah, well, I mean, what I should have introduced at this point, Tolly, is the farm is about 11. Just run us through the physics of the physical parameters of the place, the geography of it. It's about 11 hectares.
Yeah, we're just under 20 acres, so we're about just under 7.5 hectares. We're quite small by farm standards. We're incredibly small. A conventional run farm of this size would not exist anymore. It's not viably profitable. The picture here gives us just a part of the farm. This is two of our fields. We're bordering the River Thames. In fact, we were slightly in the River Thames last week, but not too much. The River Thames is a constant kind of threat which is in the background, and we're kind of used to it. Every 8 or 10 years it kind of invades, and that's okay. We're used to that. We are in what was originally the floodplain of a tributary that ran to the Rhine. We heard about the Dogger Bank today. The River Thames ran right away across there into the Rhine. So, you know, we are conscious of the fact that we are very close to water. The farm is surrounded by, as you can see, it's quite a biodiverse area. We've got lots of trees. We've also planted lots of trees. You can see the field in the foreground there, which is all in lovely, neat, straight rows, but also has lots of rows of trees. This is agroforestry. This is, again, about the reinstatement of biology and biological systems. I'm passionate about the role that trees play in agriculture, but not just trees that look nice, but trees which are used. We use these trees in different ways. We chop them up, we put them onto the ground. We have brought the forest fauna into our fields. The biology that goes with forests, the incredible range of fungi and bacteria which most agricultural land has lost in the last 200 years, we are reinstating that through the use of wood chip technology, and we were the first farm ever in the UK to seriously take this on, certainly in horticulture. So we're bringing the fungi back. We're bringing back what has been lost from these soils. You need to understand that this field has been in agriculture now for, we know of, the best part of 2,000 years and possibly longer. I took it on at a point when it was pretty much at the end of its life almost. It had been seriously degraded. It's very thin, it's poor quality soil, it's grade 3B and grade 4. It's not considered anything suitable for horticulture at all. So that's kind of the background to the site.
I mean, just one thing to emphasise, although Tolly has this whole system process and talks about and seeing it holistically as all the parts working together, and that the agricultural outcomes are, as it were, inadvertent, it is many tonnes of food you are producing. How many tonnes is it?
It varies from year to year. Last year wasn't really a vintage year, but we're around 100 to 120 tonnes a year. It's above the national average for a farm of this type.
So it's 100, and I ran this past one of the new gods of agriculture, Jake Fines, who runs the conservation estate at Holcombe, and Jake worked for many years at Raveningham, working on agricultural systems. And I mean, he uses all the intensive methods and was very, very impressed by that kind of output. So this is an incredibly productive farm. But just take us back, Tolly, because some people won't quite understand perhaps, or only vaguely understand, why are fungi and that diversity of plants and the use of your concern for soil and for the relationship between plants and fungi, how is that helping fertility? What's happening in that process? What are you capturing?
Right, well, we're not 100% sure what is happening in that process. It's so complicated. We do know it's happening. And what we've been able to demonstrate on our farm is without resorting to inputs in terms of fertilizer, this land has had no fertilizers at all. While I've been there, which is 35 years, it didn't get any before that for 10 years either. It's had no inputs of that type for over 45 years. It's had a little bit of wood chip, but very small amounts. It has a very small amount of compost. What we've seen is a very steady, not a rapid, but a very steady increase in fertility. And that fertility is closely linked to the biological activity of the soil, which we can measure in various ways. And the best way is through earthworms, and because we can see them. But what we're seeing is plants which are able to find the nutrients they want. Most agriculture is based on the assumption that we know what plants need. And I don't think that's true at all. I think plants are much better judged of that than we are. So what we're doing, we're allowing the plants to find their own nutrients, and we're just making the biological machine, if you like, there available so that plants can do that. So plants can access nutrients they would not have got into 40 years ago when the soil was badly degraded. It's purely an action of fungi and bacteria. I don't quite understand how it all works. I'm not hugely scientifically minded. I know it does work. There's very close relationships we know between some fungi, particularly mycorrhiza, and phosphate release, and plants. We've opened up, rather than having we've only actually got about 8 or 9 inches of topsoil, but we've actually got a whole metre of rubbish, chalk and stuff below that. We're bringing nutrients from there. We have really deep-rooting green manures within the rotation, which are bringing nutrients up on a regular basis. This is very small amounts of nutrient, but it's making it available to plants. So the biology, the fungi and the bacteria have become really important. We understand that within our soils, and we've been looking at them for a very long time, that we have become more fungal dominant than we were previously, and that some of the bacteria has declined. We've had some recent work done with Netrometrics looking at the eDNA of our soil, which was very revealing. We don't understand anything about what that actually means, but we know there's a huge amount of stuff going on in our soil. So it's really about the relation between fungi and bacteria. And the reason we've got all this fungi and bacteria is twofold. Firstly, because we're using a wide range of different plants, particularly green manure type plants, but also the weeds that are present there, and also the very small amount of wood chip, which is bringing in particularly useful fungi.
Yes, and I mean, what people have discovered, just to sort of recap, Tolly talked about mycorrhizal fungi. These are essentially interconnected relationships between fungi and plants, angiosperm plants, which have been in existence since these organisms colonized the terrestrial planet, which is 400 million years ago. All plants interact with fungi. We're coming to realize that fungi represent one of the absolute mainstays. You've probably heard about it as the wood wide web, so that a third of all the organisms under a forest is the fungi which are in relationships with the trees. But what Tolly has done is recreated almost natural systems of diversity with all these underlays, creating fungal communities probably, of which there can be 200 kilometers of hyphae, which are the little tendril threads, less than a millimeter in diameter of the fungi, of the mycelium of the fungi, passing through every single meter of soil, 200 kilometers. Once you start to introduce artificial fertilizers and pesticides, including, of course, fungicides, what happens to the soil?
Well, you kill a lot of that fungal activity, and then the soil starts to shut down, and then you start to lose earthworm populations, and once you start to lose earthworm populations, you get into a situation where drainage is compromised. I mean, we all worried about flooding and global warming. Well, most of the flooding we see actually is not about global warming. Most of the flooding is because it's been raining, of course, but that rain is not getting through the land, it's running off the land. Much of flooding is due to bad management of soils. You go anywhere this time of year, you can see thousands of hectares of land completely bare of any living thing at all, where they've been growing maize, some of which goes into biofuel, some of which goes into feeding cattle, dairy cows. It's a complete desert, and those soils are completely degraded, and they are contributing to the flood risk. So once you lose that good drainage, that soil structure, what we call the crumb structure of the soil, you start to lose the whole system. So our system is really completely dependent on the soil initially, but the soil is dependent on the biological diversity above it. So we're not looking at just the soil, we're looking at the whole environment of the farm, which is so important to us. It's that complete systems approach of the farm.
The other thing I should say, of course, is that we were talking earlier with Helen and Laura were talking about, Sarah were talking about one farmer can manage 1,000 acres. What's the human community on your place?
Well, we've got a human stocking rate if you want to call it a stocking rate, it's about half a person per hectare. So we've got four people or 5 people really on just under 8 hectares. It's a high stocking rate, but the farm is able to to pay those wages. Obviously, we have to. We live in the real world. Up till this year, we have not received any government support whatsoever for what we do. We don't get payments. We're not a farmer with payment. We do start to get money this year because we tick all the boxes of ELMS in terms of soil preservation, biological diversity, all those things. We're going to get, for us, what sounds like quite a lot of money. It's £4,000. It's enough to pay the wages for 2.5 weeks. So for us, it's a big leg up, but we're not relying on that. My neighbouring farmer, who is also organic, has over 300 acres, 125 hectares. 70% of his income is coming from basic payment scheme, which is going to get whittled away. He's really worried, and he has a right to be really worried because he's going to be in a really difficult position. I feel for these farmers. This is not a good situation for many of them.
So this is a whole system. I mean, this whole system approach starts with the mycorrhizal communities, the bacterial communities in every spoonful of soil, but it goes right up to the humans, and that's the extraordinary part of Tolly's achievement for me. But take us back to the very heart of your, well, I suppose you maybe have covered it, Tolly, but I just wondered if you wanted to say any more about your using your eyes to look at soil health. I mean, maybe we've covered it, but I just wondered if there was anything you're famous for just take the audience through the carbon content of your soil compared with your organic neighbour.
Yeah, this was an interesting one. We were very lucky over the last couple of years to be subject to some very comprehensive data collection of our soils. And we've always had collection of our soils, and we've been looking at various aspects of soil, but we never had the opportunity to go into such details we did last year and the year before, where we were able to go a metre deep over the whole farm, the whole rotation, and my neighbours' fields, who are organic but pasture-fed beef, and compare our carbon content. Because at the back of my mind was this kind of slightly troubling nag that we were perhaps exploiting our deep-down carbon in order to increase our yields, and that, yes, we've seen a very small increase in carbon in our top few inches, but what was happening deeper down? So it's really encouraging when the results came back that it was quite clear that our carbon level has not been trashed. It compares every bit as favourably with my livestock neighbour, who's never ever, this is on land that's never been ploughed, and also not received any inputs other than occasional grazing. So we're kind of confident that we know we can keep this going more or less sustainably. We've had 35 years experience. What we did show against my neighbour was we had slightly more carbon deep down. And this is important because the deeper you put carbon, the safer it becomes, the more resilient it is. And I mentioned the word resilience, which I haven't really come up with yet, but I mean the farm, everything about the farm is geared towards resilience. I didn't wake up one day and think, I'm going to make my farm resilient. I didn't wake up one day and think, I'm going to make this farm really biologically functional. It kind of happened. It was, for want of a better word, it was an organic kind of
it comes out of your vision, though, doesn't it?
Well,
your whole system.
Yes, it does come out of a vision, but if
you didn't know how it was working.
I didn't know how it was going to work. I didn't know what that vision was going to end up as. It was been a long process. I could do it much quicker today, of course. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. But the biological function of the farm is really the most important part of what we do, and everything hinges on that biological function.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we should also say that Tolly's carbon is higher on his land than on his neighbour's organic livestock farm. Tolly is taking off 100 tons of edible crops, and the livestock farm is producing, well, I don't know what its annual cull will be, but it'll be less than 1/10 of the value of the produce you're producing.
We've never compared it in terms of calorific value of food, which would be an interesting thing.
Yes,
to do.
that would be, I suppose,
that would be a more accurate way of measuring it. But our feeling is that we have fed more people during that time.
And you've had no subsidies and no government inputs.
Absolutely none whatsoever. No. And one of the big policy drivers of the farm is to be able to demonstrate that we can survive in agriculture with a much less reduced livestock element, because I think almost everybody agrees that livestock's a big problem in terms of global warming. We have to reduce the numbers, we have to reduce the impact of livestock. So we're kind of getting ready for that day, really, when livestock numbers will drop, as they did during the war, out of necessity, to very low levels, and we're going to have to farm without manures. And many people will often say, well, how can you do that? And we think we have some solution towards that.
Yeah, so one of the things that Tolly was saying is that, sorry, I've lost my train of thought, but I just want to return to one thing, which is that, the Murky Waters project. They talked about the cost of, to us, and the impact of all those nutrients coming off agricultural environments and off our own sewage, etc., which are causing devastation. The value of those inputs at an EU level has been calculated. The value of all those pesticides, all those nitrates, the fertilizers we put on the ground, are less valuable to us in total terms than the cost in cleaning up the effects of those effective pollutants overall. So Tolly has a system that is producing no toxic waste whatsoever. I think the other thing that's extraordinary about your work is this use of this wood chip, fertilized wood chip. Just take people through that. That's the only input that you have on the land, isn't it?
Yeah, so this is just a bit of our... This is our soil. If anybody wants to have a look, see what our soil is made up of. We've pioneered the use of Ramure chip wood. It's not completely new. It has a history in France and North America, actually, in the past. It's kind of got forgotten about. But we're using Ramure chip wood, which is coming from our own sources. We grow it ourselves on the farm. We have an area of willow coppice, which is on a piece of land which is not fit for food production. It floods in the winter. It's very wet. So we're producing our own wood chip, which in itself creates a fantastic biological function on the farm in terms of having a coppice on the farm is really valuable for biological function. That wood chip is going onto our land, and it's going on in very modest amounts. We're not plastering it 3 inches deep. It's going on at very modest amounts. What that does, it brings in that fungal activity to the soil. The soil which has been lacking that fungal activity for so long, it brings that back in. And we can see where we're using this, we see a fantastic range of fungi literally living on the surface of the soil. We only use this Ramure wood chip on land, which is in what we call a rejuvenation stage. I avoid the word regenerative, because it's become downgraded to something else. Rejuvenation stage of the rotation, which is where we build fertility over a 2.5-year period. We have no tillage, we have no cropping, we are just building diversity in the soil. We're building carbon, we're building biological function, we're building earthworm populations, which at this point get to up to 15 million per hectare. And if you have any idea what that looks like, well, I'm not too sure. It's about 15 tons. So if you imagine a bulk builder's bag, it's 15 of those writhing in earthworms for every hectare. They are moving vast amounts of soil, and they are processed in this Ramure wood chip. So it's applied at a point in the rotation of our farm when the soil can assimilate that wood chip, whereas it wouldn't at other points in the rotation where we have possibly crops which would perhaps be damaged by that wood chip.
Yes, I mean, it's also interesting to say that of British trees, sallow or willow, as Tolly calls it, is the most insect-rich environment, the third most insect-rich of all British trees. So the willow is itself part of the natural system in exactly the way that the human ecology as farm is richer. His willow, his chip wood is full of white throats and black caps and blue tits and other warblers, etc. So it is an ecosystem in itself. But so the wood chip is having a massive effect and enhancing its fertility, and therefore is the only input that you have on the farm. I mean, we're coming towards when we can throw it open to the audience. Are you happy? Is there anything more that you want to say about the place?
I could brag a bit more about our biodiversity because I love talking about it. We've had 2 studies done. We're really lucky we get a lot of studies done on our farm because our farm is actually quite unique. There's almost nowhere that hasn't had fertiliser or animal inputs for 35 years that people can look at. So we are very lucky. We've had 2 groups of lepidopterists who come round to study butterflies and moths, and these are macro rather than micro lepidopterists. I mean, the micro ones only look at things below 3 millimetre. They come around and spend the whole evening on the farm with lights, and they trap all sorts of butterflies and moths, and we've had some incredible results. I mean, they were jumping up and down with ecstasy last time where they found one unknown species and one extremely rare species. 157 species were found in just a few hours one night, and they reckon this was one of the highest they'd ever found on a farm. So, this degree
Which is extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, this degree of biological function and food production, and this is what I think people need to understand is we're not just having all this biology, we're also feeding people at the same time. It's about making biological systems really cool, productive, and making them enhance the environment rather than degrade the environment. I think this is the important point. We can show that we can enhance the environment and still have food at the same time.
Yeah, so it's a complete it's an extraordinary achievement. It is a complete system, and I can just add, because I regularly catch moths myself. I mean, to have a moth trap with 50 species in is exceptional. In the height of summer, you do have high numbers, but 150 is incredible. And what it adumbrates is that the farmland area that he is in will hold probably something like 800 species, if you can get 150 in one night, which is a third of the entire lepidopteran community in Britain. So he has an extraordinary natural landscape as well as producing great food. Anyway, we'll throw it open to the audience now, Tolly, but I'm hoping people will be inspired to ask questions or terrified, I don't know which. Yeah, there's a gentleman at the back. Yes.
Take that. Your stock-free farming, why do you believe stock-free farming is important when the world is being told about regen and bringing stock back onto land?
I've got the question. If you could repeat, well, I'll repeat the question. The question was, the thing about stock-free, why I think stock-free is really good. And, regen agriculture is also talking about bringing livestock back onto land in order to increase soil health. And I can understand why they might be thinking that. We've showed quite clearly that's not necessarily the case. You can still restore land. You can still make it really fertile without bringing livestock on. The problem with bringing livestock onto land is it reduces how much land you have to feed people directly. 65% of all cereals grown in the UK are feeding livestock. It's a huge amount. Much of that is in really horrible factory farms, which I think everybody here would not want to see. So we are just really promoting that form of agriculture if we increase livestock levels on existing farms. So we're at a point where we are pretty clear that we can increase fertility and make food available without having to have livestock. So when the crunch comes and farmers have to reduce their livestock by 50%, over the next 10 years or whatever that they decide to do, we have a solution, we think, to increasing and maintaining fertility on farms without the use of livestock.
So sorry, everyone, for always asking questions. The willow, as a tree, you say that history of that it's been used in the past I don't know if it's always been the willow that's been used, but I'm really intrigued, particularly because of the properties of willow bark with salicylic acid and the relationship with aspirin and the kind of medicinal qualities both to the water. I had never heard of it being used in this way within the soil. So you referenced in America and in past in the UK. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that relationship with the willow.
Right, okay. In many parts of the world where they're using this technology, ramial chipwood, it may not necessarily be salix or willow varieties, it may be other species. We use willow because it's very productive, it produces a lot. It does have, as you point out, lots of other incredibly beneficial virtues, and medicinal is one of them. It's been shown to have real effect on soil health. It's also been used experimentally in controlling diseases in conventional apple orchards, and it has been shown to have some merit there. So it's got lots of other properties. We like it primarily because it increases so much biological diversity on the farm anyway, and it's very easy to manage. We coppice this on a 7-year rotation. It's highly productive. We're getting, I think it's about 8 cubic meters of wood chip plus firewood every year from a very small area of land. So it's very productive in that sense.
And it grows very quickly, and you can just simply stick a willow stick in the ground and you get tree growth. So it's incredibly flexible.
It is. It's completely idiot-proof from the growing sense. You can even plant them upside down and they still work. I've tried it because I didn't believe this. Someone told me, well, you put them upside down, they still work. No. So I had to try it, and yeah, they're right, it will work. So you cannot go wrong. You throw it on the ground in a wet place, it will regrow. It's got incredible powers of rejuvenation, the word I use for our long-term grass and clover lays.
Yeah, question in the middle, lady.
Thanks. What role does crop rotation play in your system?
Yes, crop rotation is very important. It allows us to have periods of rejuvenation, so fertility building. It allows us to control disease problems. We inherited 2 quite persistent and not very nice diseases on the land from wartime activity. I mean, when you take on a farm, you also take on a history of how that land's been used. And this land had been badly managed during the war. It was very heavily cropped with potatoes and onions. Consequently, we've got 2 diseases of those 2 crops. So rotation allows us to manage those diseases to a point where we really don't see any obvious effects of those diseases. It also allows us to get green manures in at the right time to build fertility, and that also allows us to build biological diversity. So the rotation for us is really critical. It kind of complicates the whole thing quite a bit, and we've actually got 3 rotations on the farm. We have 1 in the field, we have 1 in the wall garden, and we have 1 in our tunnel protected area. So it is complex, but it does mean to say that we can function on land which is less than ideal. It allows us really to crop on land which perhaps would not be suitable for cropping at all.
Yeah, and Mossy.
Hi, thanks for that. Very quickly, I'm not being a clever dick, by the way, because I genuinely don't know the answer to this because I don't understand it. Biodynamic farming, do you use it? Does it work if you do?
No, we don't use biodynamic farming. For those people who do use it, it definitely does work. There's no question of that. Biodynamic for us would be slightly problematical because it does involve an element of livestock production, even if it's only a ground-up cow horn, which we may not want on our farm. But I've had lots of contact with lots of biodynamic farms. They seem to work perfectly well, so I don't think there's any issue around it. It just doesn't fit our particular system.
Mossy, you had a question. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, that was absolutely Hi, Tolly. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Could you, over your 35 years, you've probably experimented a lot with different green manures, and what are the optimal ones you would use? And also, are there any crops that your whole process, are there any crops that you've really have decided that you can't grow for whatever reason?
Right, so the question was, what green manures in particular have I found to be beneficial, and which crops have we decided we can't manage? Right, okay. The green manure first. I have kind of fetishes every now and again for one particular plant. You know, and I went through the Phacelia phase a couple of years ago, and now I've gone to buckwheat and chicory. You know, I mean, it's whatever is suitable for that point in the rotation and that time in our cropping calendar, if you like. There is no one preferential green manure, and the important thing is that we have access to potentially tens of thousands of plants that could be used as green manure. The one which I've started to gravitate towards perhaps more recently is the value of weeds as green manure, because they are incredibly valuable. They know exactly when to grow and how to grow. Last year we had loads of fat hen. You know, fat hen only comes up in certain years, depending on the weather. So it is about letting nature find its own ideal, if you like, in terms of green manures. But yeah, we've got a catalogue of probably 30 or 40 we use, as well as a whole bunch of wildflowers we add to our system. In terms of crops that we've given up on asparagus after 3 attempts, primarily because our soil is not of the right type. It's a clay loam. It's not suitable to growing asparagus. We've also given up on aubergines because we have a particular soil problem, which is verticillium wilt, which means that within the rotation we would have too many of that family group, and that would compromise our ability to grow tomatoes and peppers well. So there are a few crops we have given up. There's 1 or 2 others we've given up for economic reasons. This year I've tried, me and my head grower, we've tried really hard to reduce our cropping plan, because last year we had, at one point we had, I think my wife will correct me, but we had, I think, 46 vegetables available in any one week, different types of vegetables. This is crazy. You know, we are growing more than 100 different types of vegetables. We sow more than 350 crops a year. That's one every day almost. It's hugely complex. It's quite difficult to manage, and we are trying to reduce that. So from the economic point of view, there are some crops which are going to have to go because they don't pay their way. And it sounds like a heartless kind of capitalistic approach. If you don't pay your way, you've got to go, you know. But, you know, we have to live in the real world in the farm, and the big factor for us is how much labour does it take to grow and pick and process this crop. And in some instances, it's more than the value of the crop. So we've had to get a little bit tough on some things. But in theory, there is no crop really which wouldn't grow on this site.
I just wondered, you haven't mentioned no dig, and I just wondered what your views are on that. And that's even, like, as a gardener, I disturb the soil just planting and, you know, doing stuff. So I just wonder what you think about that. And also, I think of willow trees as being very thirsty. Maybe that's not correct, because they usually are along rivers, and we live in a drought region. So what trees would you recommend planting amongst crops?
Right, I'll deal with the trees first, because that's the easy bit. Yeah, willows are quite demanding of water, but actually willows do also grow in quite dry soils. They just don't grow as well or as fast, so I wouldn't dismiss willows. Alders are also very good, although they are generally wetland trees, but they will also get very deep rooting, so they can pick up moisture. Any tree that naturally grows in your environment, look around to see what's growing, and you'll get an idea of what's suitable. In terms of no dig, we have a small element of no dig within our tunnels. We've been doing a trial for the last 8 or 10 years, looking at no dig. Our no dig is slightly different from the normal standard accepted no dig, in that we don't pile on huge amounts of compost. And the reason we don't pile on huge amounts of compost is that's taking an awful lot out of someone else's environment. I've not mentioned ghost acres. Ghost acres are what you bring in from other farms. So if you're a large-scale arable farmer and you're bringing compost from, is that our time up? No, right. If you're bringing in manure from another farm, maybe as an arable farmer, you are importing someone else's land, someone else's fertility, which has to go on the calculation, and I refer to that as ghost acres. That's someone else's land. So our no-dig doesn't rely on bringing huge amounts in from elsewhere. We have a no-dig system which is very, very lightly covered with compost from time to time. It's not as productive, actually, as our fields, where we have a tillage system. We don't have anything like the number of earthworms in our tunnels than we have in our fields, although it's much less tillage. So, you know, the whole thing about tillage, the plough has got a really bad name in the last 10 years, and Regen has done this because they have had a bad situation with ploughing. They've been ploughing too deep for too long. It's not the plough that's the problem, it's the how. It's who does it, how they do it, and when they do it. Ploughs have been used for hundreds of years. The damage only started in the last 50 years when machinery got bigger and bigger and ploughing got deeper and deeper. So tillage is not the big bogey that so many people see it. Certainly, we respect the point that when you do some tillage, you do some damage, but we repair that damage. So our rotation is about also repairing any damage that may have happened during the rotation. So no dig for us on 20 acres is not practical because it would take far too much labour, it would take very much more specialised machinery, it would take more inputs. It works really well on small scale.
Yes, sadly, folks, we've run out of time, but I hope you'll appreciate that what Tolly has achieved is absolutely extraordinary, and it's an absolute thrill for me to have him here today. So if you could show him your appreciation, that would be great. Sure.
Just the final picture is where I started, and it's with birds. And we have this fantastic population of red kites in our area that were reintroduced 45 years ago. We now have, on our farm, we can sometimes see up to 50 of these red kites following the tractor. They're there. For me, it's it is our apex predator. Apex predator is primarily living on our earthworms, and the reason we have so many is we have this fantastic earthworm population, which really shows how biologically rich our soils are. It's because that's how we got the red kites. Thank you.